Hey everyone, it's Samuel,
And I'm Kayla, or at Just Thinking K on Twitter.
and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons and Dragons.
Today in the Prime Material, we'll talk all things homebrewing.
In the wilds, the phase spider.
And in the tavern, what would you do if there was an invasive species?
All right, let's go. Thank you very much for joining me today, Kay.
Yeah, no problem. I love hopping on podcasts and talking homebrew.
Yeah, that's how I first came across all of your content, was all the mini homebrew things that you put out through your blog and through DM's Guild and other places like that. Why don't you start out by shouting out who you are and where we can find your stuff?
Yeah, so I'm Kayla. I have a blog called DM Dalliance where I post mostly weekly, uh, depending on how much freelancing stuff I'm putting out on the DMs Guild at the moment. I also post a lot of fun tidbits on my Twitter, which is again at Just Thinking K, including old posts, new posts, some ideas like I let the DMs know that technically corpses are inanimate objects, so they could be a mimicked yesterday.
I did
Uh,
see that, yes. You set my wheels a turning.
yeah, something nice and new to throw at your players for the upcoming, spooky month.
That's awesome. Well, we look forward to talking homebrew with you today. Before we get into the prime material proper, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You could find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you happen to listen. And if you would like, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can listen to the podcast that way if you prefer. Remember to check out Plot Hooks Adventures. Coming up a little bit later, we'll be starting our third session, which will feature Ben from Lawful Great Adventures, Gamer Mom Luna, and all sorts of other fun people who are all playing kids as they navigate through the war wastes in that particular adventure. So stay tuned for that coming up in the first part of October. We're also almost to our next milestone on the quest for 1K. Whenever we hit 700 followers on Twitter, which we're 80 away from at the moment, at the time of this recording, we will be giving away that huge package of stuff from Greenleaf Geek, Games by B, and Arcane Spectacles. So be sure to check that out. And finally, be sure to support us on Patreon. We've got a lot of cool content that's on the way, in addition to all the perks that you already have access to. We would genuinely appreciate your support there. But no matter what, thank you all for listening and for being part of the Plot Hooks family. But with those long winded announcements out of the way, let's get into talking home brewing. Now, Kayla, you're a prolific content creator, as we've already mentioned, in a variety of mediums, and you do even more stuff than you shouted out. But I want to focus on specifically the homebrew content that you were talking about for Dungeons and Dragons. Just about everyone's home games have some percentage of homebrew content in it, whether it's just a jokey magic item that they created, all the way up to those who have completely homebrewed worlds and classes and stories and all sorts of stuff like that. I ran a poll on Twitter a few weeks ago as I was brainstorming this topic about the percentage of homebrew that people have in their home games. And I was surprised by the results because the percentages that won was quite high. And I knew that there was a ton of content that people were creating for their own games, but people really seem to enjoy it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it's one of the tools in a DM's bag, right? To use to kind of customize the experience for their players, right? Like adventure books are great, they have great resources, they're full of stuff, but they're never going to be kind of tailored for your group the way that you could do something for your group.
Yeah.
So like the adventure's not going to know that you have a human druid who, you know, has this tragic backstory and is super connected to birds. They're not going to know that, so they're not going to know to include maybe a magic item to let them fly or something.
Sure.
Whereas you would know that.
Yeah.
Uh, it lets you kind of like blend in your players more to the world because you're incorporating things that you know they're enjoying, they're kind of wanting to go for. Even maybe their backstory, like homebrewing, maybe something that's like a family heirloom that gives them a
Mm.
benefit.
Mm.
It lets you kind of make it more impactful for your group. And I think it's one of the easiest ways that DMs kind of get into it, especially like the longer term campaigns. You
Sure.
kind of just start naturally doing it as your players are like, hey, I would like to wild shape into this, but there's not a stat block for it. How can we make that happen? And then you're like, well, I just homebrewed a whole rule set for you to study animals now, so you can add wild shapes. And I guess I just made a flying shark, so here's that stat block. Uh,
Is that generally your favorite part about homebrewing? The ability to connect players even closer to the story through just the things that you come up with?
yeah, I think it makes them a lot more invested in the world. And like the more invested in it they are, the more they're naturally going to explore the things that you've maybe spent a lot of time on that wouldn't normally come up.
Mm.
Um, like because my druid, like I homebrewed this rule set for her on how to learn new wild shapes, and I gave her a taste of a weird wild shape. She's just started scouring everything and realizing something weird is going on in the world because she's finding fusions of creatures that
Mm.
shouldn't exist.
That's pretty awesome. And you obviously do create a lot of stuff to publish, but you're also doing a lot of stuff for your own groups. What's your typical process like? Is it more so just seeing a need in the story and seeking to homebrew something directly for that, or do you do a lot of preemptive homebrew, I guess you could say, for things that might come up in your campaigns, or do you just like sitting down and coming up with stuff? How does that typically work for you?
So it's like a combination of things. For one of the main campaigns I'm running right now, it's like I would say maybe 80% homebrew.
Mm.
Um, so a lot of the, you know, planning beforehand, I do a lot of homebrew as well. But I do love just kind of homebrewing off the fly up questions like my players have, or maybe like
Mm.
my players doing something really impactful in the moment, and I'm like, well, I have to make something to like commemorate this. Like I had a cleric that had kind of been a player that made some really iffy decisions and almost got them destroyed by some like level 20 wizards. Um, but they had encountered these fire elementals like guarding this door and not letting them through. And instead of fighting them, like they took the time to talk to them and found out like they're bound to protect this thing because their children have been taken. And so like instead
Mm.
of fighting and destroying these fire elementals, he like makes a blood oath and a vow on his with his god that he will like get the children back. And I
Oh
was just
wow.
like, I don't like I can't just like let that go and not give anything for it. So I had
Sure.
one of the fire elementals like pick up some lava and like touch his shield, and now he has like a shield that gives him fire resistance.
Oh,
Uh,
that's awesome.
yeah, so it's like sometimes it's just spur of the moment, like, oh, you just did something so in character and like so awesome that I have to just I'll figure out the stats later. Here's this
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that ability to just come up with anything is honestly one of the best things about TTRPGs in general. Like, I think that's one of the main reasons that we all love it so much. And then we get to put our own stamp on it even further by coming up with stuff which is outside of the rule sets. And again, that's just something why we love these games, because you can't do that with Monopoly. You can't, I guess somebody out there has probably added extra row somewhere and turned it into a pentagon instead of a square shape. But generally speaking, those type of things are pretty firm in the way that they have to be run, and that's not the case with Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and I feel like that leads itself to a lot of like ingenuity, not just like on the DM side, but on the player side as well. Like people forget that players have some like homebrew capabilities, right?
Mm.
Especially like certain classes. Like if you're a wizard and you want to try and maybe figure out how to make a spell that does blank effect, yeah, you're gonna have to work closely with your DM, but like that's a player kind of taking that homebrewing by the reins. Or maybe it's an artificer who's like, I want to try and invent this thing, how do, and the DM being like, this is gonna break things, isn't it? Okay. So so like it's not just a one-sided thing in games. Like both sides have some homebrewing capabilities and powers that just really, I think, make the game that much better.
Now, whenever you do that home brewing on the fly, do you find that that is more so initiated by the players, or do you ever just come across a situation where you are just like, I didn't think that this needed something extra, but I'm going to throw this in here because this just came to me and this is really cool?
Yeah, like our paladin isn't super sure who it is that they're getting their powers from, because they have a bit of an amnesia thing going on. So they had found this weird sword that they hadn't done identify on yet. It took them a while to remember to
I
do that.
love it whenever they don't have identify.
Or they forget. They just like pick it up and they're like, "Oh yeah, we should have asked the caster to do that before touching it." Yeah. Uh, um, but I took that as a moment because I knew it was like a type of weapon they would want. It was like the type of jam that they had been going for the whole time, and I was like, okay, but what if this is like a blessed weapon from
Hmm.
their patron? So maybe I can start giving them a story arc that they can hook into later on that involves their patrons, so maybe they can start figuring out who that is, because they're just kind of getting vague like flashes right now, and they're not
Sure.
super sure. And every time they get a flash of their patron, they also get a flash of the event that made them forget everything. So it's like
Mm.
they eventually we're gonna have to deal with that. So give them an item to kind of like make that a reminder with some benefits, a little bit of extra smite, a little bit of ability to light the way because we have way too many humans in the party.
Now, a lot of these things is the really, really fun part of homebrewing. It's the coming up with just really cool things which make really cool moments and really add to our collaborative storytelling. The harder elements and the element which I think provides a roadblock to a bunch of different creators is the mechanical elements. Whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or a different TTRPG rule set, it can be difficult to figure out things as far as how to make sure it's balanced, how to make sure that it comes across with the desired effect. And it can just be challenging. It can really be a roadblock. How do you generally go about fine tuning the mechanical aspect of home brewing?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about how to get into homebrewing a little bit in my blog and on different sites as kind of like a guest writer before, but like the greatest and easiest way to kind of like teach yourself how to see that balance, how to see the mechanics where it might break, is to kind of just start small with homebrewing. Like
Mm,
everyone thinks homebrewing refers to just like purely inventative, brand new thing, but it encompasses so much more than that. It's you can reskin something so that it seems different, but you didn't touch the mechanics in that one. You can switch out abilities that are equivalent so that they have the same kind of effect without breaking anything. You can do small things, and like the more small things you do, you kind of get a feel for things, like
mm,
what's going to break, what's not going to break. especially if you're using it in games with your players. When you hand them over, you very quickly find out what is broken and what is not broken, because they will figure out how
They will
to
figure it
hit
out.
that loophole and break everything. And you're like, oh, I really should have someone cast Disintegrate on that item.
I love that idea of reskinning. One of my favorite things actually just happened this past week in Plot Hook's Adventures. Whenever Lex's character, he's a lizard folk, and he is a druid, or druid barbarian multiclass, and he uses Thorn Whip a lot. But his Thorn Whip is just his tongue shooting out of his mouth like a chameleon. And that's just something that is very flavorful and is just amazing. And they have an amazing sound effect that goes along with it. And that's just something that's so simple. It doesn't affect anything mechanically, but that is at its core starting a path of home brewing.
Yeah, and exactly. And for the player, like that is like the best thing ever, right? Like instead of
Yeah.
using a thorn whip, being able to just like flick out the tongue and do it. And it's small things like that that kind of like you start getting a feel for things. You probably start the process of home brewing. Like I have a barbarian turtle in one of my games, and he
Mm.
was like, "Hey, instead of a maul, can I have a giant frying pan?" And I was like, "Sure, it's just gonna have the stat block of the maul, and you can cook on it later, I guess." Like, so like those things kind of like they don't have a big impact mechanic wise because it's the same stat block. It's doing the same actions.
Mhm.
But for the player, like that little bit of a homebrew, just that like new skin on something, totally changes the experience. They're way more into their character because of it. They're way more into the game because of it, because they get to do this really cool thing that's special for their character.
Mm. It's awesome. Now, once you get further up towards the larger stuff, when you start doing things, going up to crafting, magical items or individual spells, and then all the way up to, eventually crafting things like classes or races, and then all the way up to just creating a setting from scratch and everything in between. How do you handle it when you start getting to bigger things?
I do a lot of research, probably
Mm.
way too much research. I think my browser hates how many tabs I have open when I create things. Um, but a really great thing about the D&D community, 5e especially, is just like the amount of information that's so easy to pull. So if you are hesitant and thinking maybe like an ability you want a monster to have might break the game or might break the encounter, I would say look at what that ability is. Like, what's the very base function of it? Like, does it drain HP? Does it drop Constitution down? Like, what does it do? And then look for monsters that have a similar ability so you can kind of see like the wording, because especially with stat blocks, if you're handing it to a player or you're publishing it, maybe like the wording of things is very important because it limits how easy it is to break. It limits kind of the function so that it's not overpowered or anything.
Mm.
So keeping in mind and knowing what those like limiting words are, those phrases that are being used for an ability like draining con or draining intelligence, um, like checking out like the intellect devour if you're wanting to do something that drains intelligence and drops somebody like that, so that you know what those limiting factors are that have been used. And then you can always play and change out those limiting factors. How many times the monster can use the ability, or how strong that ability is, how long it takes to go into effect. You can break the rules, but you can't break too many of the rules, right? Like you can't break all of them. But
Mm.
if there's a couple that you need to break in order to customize it, and with the wording that you have, it's not going to be overpowered, you have that wiggle room at that point to kind of be
Mm.
like, okay, what says, it's like only has like one use a day or one use per target. But if I maybe further limit it, like less psychic damage is done when it happens, I can just let it do the attack and maybe not limit it once a time per target. But maybe it ups the CR. Like now that creature that maybe would be really easy to handle for your level 5 party is not gonna happen until like level 10.
Mm.
But just remembering kind of the limiting factors and the rules that you break, just kind of keeping track of them because it is going to change CR. Even if you don't think it will, like it doesn't do a lot of damage. If there are a lot of saves in attacks or something, and your players have a really bad night
Yeah, yeah.
of rolling, they're gonna get decimated.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, and that goes back to the idea that you mentioned about just being willing to look at other things, like, and starting with things like reskinning. There's this stigma that you have to be this uber creative person as a DM, and being uber creative means coming up with something 100% original, which means sitting down with a piece of paper, not looking at the monster manual, not referencing any other abilities, but just coming up with something out of your own brain. And you're just like, it doesn't have to work that way. We're putting too much pressure on ourselves in home brewing, and we'd be much more likely to break something whenever we don't give ourselves the opportunity to do the research.
Yeah, and it's not saying like people forget a lot of times like yeah, people have been playing like a long time. I've been playing like 15ish years. When a DM starts to describe a certain monster, I'm like, I know what this is. We're all dead. We're all dead. All dead. All dead. But you can flip that on its head, right? Like you can take a description of another monster and apply it to a stat block that has nothing to do with it.
It's true.
You want to terrify your players, take a vampire description and stick it on like a ghoul or something and be like, sup, this is what's going on. And they will flip out because like they're not supposed to fight that vampire for like another 6-7 levels. What's going on here?
Do you find as you create that you ever end up with any roadblocks, sort of creators, writer's block, so to speak? And if so, is there anything you do to overcome that?
Yeah, I when I hit those kinds of things, I kind of take a break and maybe flip over to another media, movies, books, music, and kind of get like a give my brain a chance to work on the problem, but also kind of continue to take in information from other sources that might like jar something loose. Like maybe I'm not happy with the way like I'm getting ready to put out a book of ghosts for the spooky season for people to
Mhm.
use. And at one point I was just sitting there like I don't like I know lore wise what I want this ghost to be. I know generally what I want the abilities to do, but like I don't know how to go about it. Like what ways can I make it themed that this ghost really has the impact that I want it to have. And I
Mm.
went and watched like probably 3 Halloween movies and came back. I was like, okay, I got this. I know how to do this now. Uh, it's going to be an accursed object. It's going to drain the life out of someone. And then it's going to pop up and be like, let's go. And then when you think it's gone, it's not gone. It's just going to go back to the cursed object. So we've got this.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, we had a question that came in on Patreon as we've sort of been working up in this conversation from the small scale of homebrewing all the way up towards the largest. Andrew asked the question, if you're talking about the big thing, the settings, the environments that the players are playing in, whether that is the setting as a whole, the entire kingdom, or just a local town, or something like that. You talked a lot about how you use homebrew to hook players into their particular stories. What hints or clues do you generally try to place in front of the players to show them the homebrewed stuff, so to speak? Whenever they're in this new city, what do you place in front of them to show them the differences in this culture, the differences in this environment? That can sometimes be hard to do in a way that draws the player's interest. Sometimes we could check out a little bit during the description because we were just, oh, this is fantasy town Z. What do we place in front of our players to get them intrigued about finding out more about this new environment they're in?
I try and like, especially if I know I'm doing a longer campaign or I've played with the players before, I try to establish kind of like a set of touchstones when I'm like getting them into a new city, getting them into a new country or culture. Um, that way, I know what things to maybe play with or twist. In one of the campaigns I'm running, I have like 7 countries.
Mm,
Some of the players are from different ones. But one of the countries that has been closed off for 50 years or whatever, and is just now starting to let people back in, very much under supervision for trade and things.
mm,
And it is a very different. I have twisted every touchstone that I have given them up until this point with them. It is a society that is essentially all about necromancy. Their rulers have a council of advisors that are just people who have passed on, who have been considered like the epitome of that topic or the expert of that topic to be able to provide counsel for whoever the next ruler is. Um,
interesting.
they have people who volunteer their bodies after death to be the labor force for the country. So all of the things that they have seen in all the other countries, where it's very much kind of the typical setting of D&D, is completely destroyed with this country, and it's almost immediately put everyone kind of at unrest, even though like it's nothing bad. Like these people volunteered to be the labor force. Your family actually gets money for you being in that labor force after you die, but it's necromancy, so I mean it's gotta be bad, right? uh, so I always try to establish those touchstones, because then you can also, even if you're in a country where those touchstones have been the same for the last like 3 cities, right? It's that same kind of fantasy feel. It's that same kind of small town. It's very much like walking through the town at the opening of Beauty and the Beast, right? It's like that bonjour, good morning,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Then, if they step into a small town, maybe in the middle of a forest, and no one talks to them, no one says hello, everyone just kind of closes the doors and all of the windows, and no one will do business with them, and no one will look them in the eye. Like your players are going to know something's wrong, and
Mm,
players being players, they're going to want to know why.
sure.
So yeah, I would say just kind of like summarize touchstones and then twist those touchstones whenever you feel like you need to put your players back on their toes so that they kind of get back invested in trying to figure out what's going on.
Sure. Oh, makes a lot of sense. We have something that I am a small part of collaborating on, which you are helping lead over with Jess Finley. You want to talk a little bit about the upcoming release on the DM's Guild Dark Reflections?
Yes. So kind of again touching on, I guess, flowing from talking about touchstones and twisting them. We have taken fairy tales and princesses that everyone's kind of familiar with just from like movies, television, and reading stories as a kid, and asked kind of the questions of what if it wasn't a happily ever after, what happens to a princess when it goes wrong instead of goes right, and have provided the twisted retellings of some fairy tales for you to play through in adventures. You get the princesses, you get minions, you get new magic items. Everyone has their own adventure to go through. You could play through the whole book if you really wanted to do just kind of like a fairy tale campaign, or you can just drop them into whatever campaign's going on. So that is coming out soon. We are chugging away at the editing to get that all ready for y'all.
Mm,
And if you would like updates for that, you can follow me or Jess Pendley on Twitter, and we will have updates as things move along.
yes, it's so exciting. It's so good.
Yeah, every time I read one of the stories, I'm like, I just want to talk all about it everywhere, but I can't.
Yes, I can't wait. I can't wait. It's going to be amazing. Um, But I think that is going to wrap up our quick discussion on homebrewing. What do we say we head over to the wilds and talk about some spiders?
Yes, the bane of my existence, my nemesis.
All right, we're out here in the wilderness. Today we are talking about the phase spider. And I was brought about to this because of one of the more popular blog posts that you've made. Was way back in February 2019. You did a great Monster of the Month post about spiders and different ways of using them in the encounters. And my favorite spider is the face spider. So I figured that would be a great one to talk about.
Yeah, the phase spider is a really great thing to kind of just throw at your players whenever they least expect it, because it can be a doozy.
Yes, especially if they don't know, like, what is coming. If they're a player who has never encountered these things before, they're like, "Oh, here's this giant Shelob. It just happens to be blue and white." Oh, but no, in fact, it actually has the specific ability to be able to shift between the prime material plane and the ethereal plane, which makes them much more difficult than just a giant spider would typically be, as scary as that already sounds.
Yeah, a lot of I think phase spiders is probably one of the spiders that just kind of like never really get played out that much because there's giant spiders and then you skip over to all the other monsters.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't even unfortunately have their own space in the monster manual. They're despite being such a unique creature, they're just in the appendix along with the other beasts in appendix A of the D&D 5e monster manual. They're CR3 monsters with a AC of 13 and 32 hit points, but since they don't have that lore associated with them, there's nothing canonized in 5th edition, and depending on the source you look at, they could be native to the material plane, and they just have this ability to go back and forth between the ethereal plane and the material plane as just an attack method, or I guess a hiding method, or in some sources they could be ethereal plane creatures and they just are coming from there back and forth to the prime material as sort of a hunting ground, I suppose. But either way, they have this feature called ethereal jaunt, which allows them to shift between the two planes as a bonus action, which gives them a sort of pseudo teleport effect, or at the very least, a way to attack and then bamf out for a turn and just evade capture, which makes them really interesting creatures.
Yeah, and it's like you said, I think they get like three sentences outside of their stat block, and I think it's
Yes.
all about describing their ability to do that ethereal jaunt. So I mean, but that leaves room for a DM to kind of play with whatever they want to make the lore of that creature in their
Sure.
game.
Yeah. Great opportunity for homebrewing.
Yeah,
And of course, you don't have to. As far as ways you can use these amazing creatures in a story, they are just fascinating combat encounters without a story connection. If you just want to have the party come across this, the bite attack is really interesting because it has both piercing damage and poison damage. But if the poison damage kills a creature, reducing it to 0 hit points, the target is stable and does not have to make death saving throws, but they're poisoned and paralyzed for 1 hour, just stuck there. Again, Frodo being struck by Shelob, just alive, but you know, unable to do anything, which can be a really interesting thing to throw at, especially low level parties, as they're now trying to drag their party mates out of a phase spider nest, half of which are unconscious and covered in spider webs. They can spider climb, which makes them really interesting as a combat encounter. They can walk on webs, ignoring movement restrictions that are caused by those, which allows you as a DM to create a really interesting battlefield with difficult terrain. So they can just make a great combat encounter, even if you don't want to mess with the lore.
Yeah, and then especially I like with their stat block, they can web walk, but they don't since they don't shoot out like their own webs, like stat block wise at least they don't
Hmm.
produce their own webs. I think that lends itself really well to being like having maybe additional spiders in whatever the encounter might be because maybe they kind of live in the environment the other spiders have created. So
Sure.
you could make it a much more difficult battle or really up what kind of group you can take this encounter against. You can have it at a higher level, have a couple phase spiders, have a couple other spiders in there, and really give them a run for their money.
I mean, that would be an amazing thing to throw in, creating sort of a multi spider encounter. One of my campaigns is an 11th level party right now, and there's like we have an Aarakocra, a druid, and a bard with a bardic weapon that can cast fly. And so, like literally, I think 4 of the 5 party members have the ability to fly. And having something like this, where you can just have this cave with webbing strewn across the areas, would be an interesting way of creating a difficult battle, which takes this thing that they're so used to using in a manner for their own advantage, and now it's actually a detriment, and they have to figure out how a different way to attack this particular scenario.
Yeah, I even like this as a bit of an ambush because maybe like the party has come through previously and like cleared out the giant spiders or whatever other creatures were living in this area and maybe
Mm.
just didn't get rid of the webbing and then they come back through and suddenly like some phase spiders have taken up residence and they're like, "Sup?"
That is amazing. Yeah, excellent. I guess they would be the chief ambush spider, because you really are not going to see them coming as
You
they
really are.
transport out from the border ethereal. One thing this made me think of is the in the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim. For those that have played that, you can travel to a particular place on Solstheim, I believe, where these people are taking these white spiders and imbuing them with certain abilities, and you can actually get them and start chunking them at people. You can get them where they explode and give poison. You can get them where they explode as like fire bombs, and one of the big things which is not answered in this particular lack of lore, I suppose, is how they actually ended up with this particular feature. How did they suddenly become creatures that could transport back and forth between the ethereal and the prime material plane? And what if they were like those Skyrim spiders, where they were essentially lab experiments, and the players are encountering this evil scientist as the big bad evil guy, or even just a wizard that they're trying to track down that's been a little on the nefarious end of the spectrum, and they just encounter this lab which is overrun with these experimental spiders, and they're now having to deal with the after effects of that.
I'm always a fan of the origin story of this is some mad mage machination type thing going on because that one puts the players on guard because they're like, okay, but if they made this one thing, there's probably more things that they made. So what are we gonna get hit with?
Sure.
And it also like when you do decide to throw something at them like that, like a golem maybe or a phase spider, it gives you kind of a window into starting to tweak things. Like maybe they encounter a phase spider again next time, but instead of, poison damage when it bites you, maybe it does fire damage and you start
Mm,
feeling the flames in your veins and you have to make constitution saves against that or take additional damage every round or something.
sure.
So I just like making my players really paranoid.
Yeah, no, I love tweaking stuff like that too, where there's just you add in little extra bits of information or change little extra bits. So especially those who know what this particular creature is, even if they're trying not to play it that way because their character doesn't know, it does always seep in a little bit your personal expectations and being able to subvert that by just tweaking things can be great.
Yeah, and I think even just doing like one little thing like that, switch out from like poison damage to fire damage, right? Then they just start questioning, do they actually know what this monster is without you really needing to change anything else?
That's true. As I was researching these, I came across an interesting lore tidbit from the face spider in Pathfinder, where in that particular setting, the lore states that they are natives of the ethereal plane first and transport back and forth between the ethereal and the material plane. And in that lore, their race is actually at war with fellow ethereal plane natives, the Zill. Unfortunately, Zills haven't been in a D&D book in a while, but D&D came out with a small supplement for 5th edition for Extra Life in 2019 called Mordenkainen's Fiendish Folio Volume 1, calling back to a bunch of 1st edition monsters and giving them 5th edition stat blocks. And the Zill is in that particular release. So you can have an ethereal war between the two as sort of an arc for your campaign if you want to make them not just a standalone combat encounter, but you want to really connect the phase spiders into a larger narrative. There's that option for you if you wanted to kind of connect them with the Zill.
I kind of like that. Like, even if it's not the Zill, something else, because like providing that kind of conflict on another plane that's like close enough or maybe bleeds into the material plane,
Mm,
it's just a really nice way to kind of like deepen the world because maybe it
sure.
affects the players, maybe it doesn't, but like it's gonna come through somehow.
Yeah.
Uh, suddenly they appear in mid battle in the material
Yes.
plane, right on top of the players.
Yep. Yep. I'm a big sucker for interplanar stuff myself. We've done a whole series on this podcast on using the upper planes in your story. I love that aspect of D&D, or really any TTRPG, because it makes the world feel much more unique whenever you get to literally connect different worlds to your own prime material plane.
Yeah, and I mean, even if your players aren't ready to do the kind of whole plane shifting thing, like there are ways to get them interested in it, right? Like maybe the story of the war between the phase spiders and the Zill is like a legend or like a fairy tale that parents tell their kids to keep them in line.
Hmm.
Like, don't be bad or the phase spider will come and get you.
Gosh,
So
that's
like,
terrifying.
right? I would be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go wash the dishes. I'm
I
gonna
would
go
be the
take care
best
of everything.
child in the world.
Yeah, so like you can weave in things like that. Like you can make it part of the stories that people tell, maybe at a tavern, right? And the bard at the tavern that night tells the story of the battle between the phase spiders and the Zill and the, legendary dragonborn hero who chased them to the ethereal plane or whatever you want to do for your
Mhm.
campaign. And then, suddenly the next day or 2 days down the road, or however long, they run into a phase spider and they're like, "Oh yeah, we were told something about this. Does anybody remember what the DM told us?"
Yes. We didn't think we had to write down what the bard was saying. Now we know we do. That's awesome.
Roll me a history check. Do you remember?
That's great. But however you use them, whether it's just a combat encounter or really tying them in depth to the story, face spiders are awesome creatures. And if you are curious of checking out any more ways to use other spiders, check out that blog post from Kayla. It's really awesome. And we'll see about maybe talking some more about some other spiders here on this segment coming up in a future episode.
Yes, and I actually have on the DM's Guild. I went ahead and statted out the spiders I was referencing for you to terrify your players with. So the link for the DM's Guild thing is in the blog post as well.
Awesome. That is sweet. Well, I think I've had enough time out here in the spider den. Let's head back over to the tavern and grab some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Much more friendlier confines.
Great ale.
Yes, absolutely. Again, much nicer than any of the food that was available in the last place that we just were. Um, However, we are still talking about freaky creatures in some description. Today's plot hook: what would you do if there was an invasive species? Now, what we mean by invasive species is, of course, the phenomenon which is all too common in the world, unfortunately. It's the term that's used whenever a life form, whether it be plant or animal, that is not native to an environment gets introduced to the environment, whether on purpose or accidentally, and propagates in abundance. And that results in altering the environment that they were introduced into. An example of that, where I am in North Carolina, is of course what is termed the scourge of the South, kudzu, which is a plant. I don't know if it's technically an ivy, but it is. It looks like an ivy, which was brought in, I believe, initially from Asia, if I'm not mistaken, for the purpose of controlling erosion. Yet it spread so fast and so well, it just overtakes and kills everything because it grows all the way up over the trees, choking it out of life and preventing it from getting the sun and the other nutrients that it needs, and it just can destroy whole little ecosystems. And so that's an example of an invasive species. It's a species which was not native to an area, and whether it's from lack of predators or from some other cause, this new species finds a niche in an ecosystem that they can exploit to their own advantage, and it ends up with harmful effects. And these are serious things in the real world. Plants and animals can impact the environment severely in some cases, and unfortunately, that's out of sight for most humans. In D&D, though, there's a lot more interesting things than just kudzu or foxes or any sort of animal. We can have lots of things become invasive species in a particular place. So, how about using this in a story?
Yeah, I mean, especially because, we were just talking about other planes, right? Like, you don't just have someone taking a plant or an animal from another country that you may have or another environment in that world and just being like, oops, I'm just gonna set it free. It looks sad. And having it mess with the new environment. You have things from other planes
Yep.
that can just maybe hitch a ride on someone that's visiting from the Fae, or like hitch a ride on someone that's visiting from an elemental plane, and just kind of get dropped off here, and now you have this thing growing that probably doesn't have any natural predators or things to fight against it here because it's not even supposed to exist here.
Yeah, yeah, no,
No
that's
one
very
has any
true.
way to deal with it.
Yeah. You can't get much different environments from different planar environments. Not exactly something you have in real life.
Well, and especially other planes, like even if it was just like a seed from the Feywild, right? The
Mm,
way the Feywild is described, even the plants like cause weird things that happen. The forests aren't necessarily safe to travel in and if you don't know how to deal with them. So if like an acorn got dropped and suddenly there's like a Feywild forest in the middle of the material plane, like and travelers go in but travelers don't come out, like
sure. Yeah.
something's going on there.
Yeah, that's very true. And a plant is certainly one of the things that you can do with this. There are sentient plants in Dungeons and Dragons, or kind of plant-based things like shambling mounds, where you can have something where a plant is either just voracious or enhanced by magic or some way, or fey based in some way, where it's so strong and aggressive that it's impossible to keep at bay. And you have your players come across this village, and they're having to chop down 50 trees a day because trees just are literally popping up overnight into their village, and they're struggling to even survive because it is affecting their environment so much. And the party has to go and find the root of the problem. um, uh, but you could do all sorts of things like that with plants.
Yeah, I mean, like, even things that get used a lot in the game, right? In a different environment kind of become terrifying. Like, a city whose walls are just being overtaken by assassin vines, right? Like, you're used to encountering assassin vines in, like, jungle areas and things like that, and you
Hmm.
know what to look out for. But if they're suddenly, like, climbing up the city walls and just taking over the city walls and trapping people in,
Yeah.
like, that's an entirely different experience.
Sure. And depending on the scope that you want to take of this, and this is, one of the things that makes a good plot hook for me, is it's both something you could do in a session and it's something you could make an arc around. You could have this just be, oh, players come across village, players have to go chop down the source of this particular, they have to chop down the initial tree, or have to take care of the initial issue in some way, shape, or form. Or it could be the jumpstart for an entire campaign arc where, why did this happen? Is somebody doing this? How do we stop it? And a whole investigative process. And then you're by the time you finish, you've got a 10 episode arc where you're having to deal with this terrible invasive species as well.
Yeah, I mean, because like in just looking at our real world, right? Like we have invasive species, but we also have, because we have invasive species, ways that we try to keep that from happening again.
Hmm.
Very strict, like what you can and can't bring in and out of countries, what you can and
Sure.
can't have as pets in certain areas. Assuming that you didn't write that into your world doesn't have that yet, so
Sure.
they don't track that stuff. So maybe someone is doing it without realizing it, the repercussions. Like maybe they are a plane shifter themselves and they're selling things that they find on other planes and that's getting out. So you're like in the trailing along after this plane shifter who just keeps selling things so he can have some money to keep going.
Yeah.
And then having to figure out, okay, like let's stop him, but like if he's doing this so easily, how are we going to not have to always deal with this?
Sure. Yeah, you come all the way back to some political intrigue at the end of this crazy wilderness expedition at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, and you, if you want to, you could do it like that. And you know, I I'm assuming if it's happening in the same general area or maybe across a couple different countries, like at the very least, they're gonna want someone responsible for what's going on held accountable.
Sure.
Whether it be like, I killed the guy, or like having to drag them in front of these people.
And we haven't even really touched on the idea of having actual monsters coming in and taking over an area. You could have a situation where, heck, you could even have a domino effect where the players come across a village in a snowy area, and they've all of a sudden been having problems with yetis that have been propagating and have just moved into the area and have been causing problems for them because they're just taking over all of the food resources and harming the various villagers. And then the players go to investigate that, and they realize, oh, the yetis were displaced by this other thing. And you can have uh, a lot of things occur with monsters, not just plants or not just animals, but actual, high CR monsters, where you can have this happen as well. And then at that point, you're quite often talking about two different sentient groups of individuals, where you have the needs of these, you know, monsters, as we would call them, to the needs of these villagers, and the party has to decide what to do because it's not just taking care of a plant at that point in time.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be a problem caused by the players, right? So like maybe there had been a dragon living in that mountain that had maybe kept the Yeti population down, but they slayed the dragon, they took the loot, and now the Yetis are the big dogs
That's
on the
true.
mountain in the mountain
Yeah,
range. So they're
that's
doing
true.
what they do. They're living their life, and now it's coming to a head where they're like, well, this decision you made to destroy this dragon because you wanted the loot or you decided like the dragon had to die. Like there's things that's going to happen. Like the world still lives after you leave,
Yep.
players. Like
Hmm.
what you do does have an effect.
Yeah, we oftentimes forget that, don't we? And as players, and that is a very key thing to remind them, and to especially at higher levels, whenever they're able to do so many things which affect so much, and you're just like, these things have consequences, and you have to think about that as your characters.
Yeah, I mean, like even if your campaign's just purely like a dungeon crawl, right? When you've emptied out that dungeon, that's a nice, warm, comfy spot for a lot of creatures or things to decide they're just gonna move in after you're done and gone. Like,
That's true. That's true. Well, however you choose to use invasive species in your particular narratives, there's lots of different ways to do it, and I think it will make a really interesting story. But I think that's about all the time that we have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you very much for joining me, Kayla. Do you want to shout out where people can find you again?
yes, you can find my products on the DMs Guild under Kayla Baines, or you can check me out on Twitter at Just Thinking K. Check out the blog DM Dalliance. Lots of things going on. I try to interconnect everything, so if you find one, you should be able to find everything else.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, and thank all of you out there for listening. Be sure to check out our Patreon. Check out Plot Hooks Adventures again. With the third session is beginning the beginning of October, and thank you all again for listening. From me, Samuel, and the entire rest of the Plot Hooks team: Matt, Becca, Mike, Steve, Zach, Dave, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We will see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.